The fallen bike. Becky's bike still sat abandoned in the driveway where it had fallen a week earlier. Sandra stared out the window at the bike, letting her eyes relax, causing the figure to blur and blend in with the concrete that surrounded it. Then she forced her eyes to refocus, bringing the sharp pink on the bike jumping out of their concrete muddle. A cup of coffee steamed quietly in Sandra's hand. It was full, with cream and sugar, the sweet, sticky smell ringing around her nose and up into her brain. Her brain had remained fuzzy since Becky's bike fell, no matter how much doctored coffee she drank. She tore her gaze away from the window and glanced at the clock on the stove. It was 5:30 a.m. She'd have to catch the bus to work soon. Breaking her staring match with the bike outside suddenly made her keenly aware of the freezing floor under her feet. She pulled her sweater tight around her shoulders and swiveled around looking for her slippers. They were under the kitchen table. She'd kicked them off during breakfast so she could tuck her feet under her in an attempt to keep them warmer. The slippers were gray and worn. What used to be cute, fuzzy plush slippers were now flat, matted layers that stood thinly between foot and floor. They didn't help to keep her feet warm anymore, but she slipped them on anyway, pretending they would. Remembering the time, she dumped her unsipped coffee in the sink and padded silently down the hall. The house her and Becky had lived in for 3 years was tiny, with only 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. But with the absence of Becky's voice and laughter, it seemed like an empty stone castle. Sandra coughed a little. The sound rang against her ears as it echoed off the lonely doors and walls. She pulled on her shoes and replaced her ratty house sweater with a warm coat. A scarf was twisted around her neck and gloves pulled on before Sandra grabbed her keys and purse and went out to meet the bus. "Sheesh," Sandra muttered as the cold smacked her bluntly in the face. So cold. She wished she could stay home, waiting by the phone in her warm bed with her golden retriever Max cuddled next to her. But the bills were starting to pile up, so she knew she had to go back to work. She wanted to stop, collect her thoughts before trudging on into the chill, dark morning, but she knew she'd miss her bus. She shouldn't be late on her first day back. Her boss was sympathetic to the news. When she called, he told her not to come in for a week, not to worry, to focus on herself. He knew she wouldn't be functional. Sandra shivered against a gust of cold wind. The bus was down the street, moving quickly and making no stops, since there were only 3 people on the bus. Sandra rushed to beat the bus to her stop. She pulled a gloved hand from her pocket and waved it so the bus driver could see her running in the dark. She was relieved to see him slow to a stop and ran the rest of the short distance to hop onto the warm bus. "You're early today," Sandra said, smiling as she ran her bus pass through the reader. The bus driver only grunted as he closed the doors and moved the bus to a jerking start. Sandra dropped her fake smile as she made her way to an empty seat, of which there were plenty. She sat quietly watching the lights of cars and the flashing of police car lights. She couldn't help but feel some animosity. They were so good at catching people speeding or those imperfectly parked, but they were completely inept at finding her daughter. She shook her head and tried to think of something else, or nothing at all. The bus arrived downtown far too quickly. She tried to prepare herself for returning to work. Her job required constant happiness, and the thought of customers, money, and coffee overwhelmed her. As she climbed the long escalator to the real world, she let out a sigh. The store stood in front of her, dimly lit, but with 2 figures bustling around. Luckily, her boss had allowed a temporary demotion from shift supervisor to barista. The long shifts and constant responsibility were not things she could even think of dealing with. Even after a week, she still felt displaced and detached, as if she were watching her own life on television. Sandra knocked lightly on the door and waited for Jim to come unlock them and let her in. "Hey, come on in." He was already in welcome mode, chipper and smiling. "Thanks," Sandra said, trying for a smile that was most certainly a straining look on her face. "How are you?" he asked. His face and voice were suddenly serious. "I'm fine. Fine. I just don't want to talk about it. Everything is normal," she said. Jim nodded. Of course. We'll be opening up in about 10 minutes. Great! Sandra hoped her voice didn't give away the foreboding feeling that dominated her mind. Jim went back to work then, and Sandra headed for the one cushy chair in the tiny lobby. Normally, she would buy a newspaper and read, but things weren't normal now, no matter what she'd said before. Sandra stared out the huge windows that looked down on the slick, dark streets. She could be anywhere. That's what she'd heard the police say. Even though she could give them a detailed description of the man that snatched her and his car, which way it left down the street, which way it turned at the corner, its wheels screeching like murder, she could be anywhere. Tears started to form in her eyes, and she struggled to erase the images from her mind. She shook her head, but there it was. She was standing next to the vacuum cleaner. Finally done with it, she'd started to wind the cord back when she saw Becky and her friend Sam ride into the driveway. She watched through the window as they talked and straddled their bikes. Then Sam went home, next door. She leaned down to wrap up the last of the cord, and when she looked up, he was there. In his hoodie and black car. He pulled Becky right off her bike and shoved her into the back seat. Sandra was already out the door as he pulled away, her screams and those of tires mingling and drowning each other out. Sandra shook her head again and tried to refocus her mind. A bike with its rider flew downhill, not even pausing to stop at the red light. Sandra thought quickly of the abandoned bike in her driveway. Why it wasn't being stolen she didn't know, but she wouldn't move it today. She couldn't. There was a loud click, and Jim welcomed two people inside. They seemed to unravel as they walked in, loosening scarves, pushing down hoods, and pulling off mittens. Sandra knew she'd have to clock on soon, so she pulled herself from the chair and made her way to the back. It was empty since Jim and Michelle were the only people clocked on. She slipped on her apron and grabbed a Sharpie, which she tucked into her pocket. She made her way to the register to clock on. After clocking on, she stood for a moment, thinking of shots pouring and the sour, sweet smell of steaming milk. Personally, Sandra preferred tea, but this was the only job she could get when she was abruptly laid off from her editing job. She took a deep breath and walked to the bar. Her daughter had disappeared, but she had to work as if nothing had happened, as if everything was the same, because she had to live and eat, because she had to survive until her daughter came back. Sandra attempted to shut down her actual self and just be the personality this store demanded of her. She greeted customers, took orders, and made coffee for 2 hours before her shutdown abruptly failed. It happened so suddenly. She greeted a regular customer and started to make his drink. While Sandra worked, she attempted to make small talk with the customer as usual. "How's your day going so far?" she asked. "All right, what's new with you?" The question was so innocent. It wasn't searching for a real answer, only the standard "nothing much, just working" sort of answer. It was then, in the midst of steaming some soy milk for a dry cappuccino, that she realized her daughter wouldn't be coming back. She stared down at the steam wand as it struggled to make foam out of soy. She was holding the pitcher all wrong. Her daughter wasn't coming back. There was no reason to do this anymore. What was the point? Abruptly, the pitcher fell to the ground, sending soy every which way. The steam wand hissed angrily on, warming the air. Sandra walked to the back, completely unaware of the stares from customers and the questions from Jim and Michelle. In the back, she pulled on her coat and grabbed her purse. As if in some sort of trance, without a word, she walked through a line of 12 to the cold, rainy morning outside. She didn't stop walking until she reached the waterfront and the ferry terminals. The Victoria Clipper sat in front of her, waiting to embark. She bought a ticket and kept walking.